Hi, my name is Leandro Facchinetti, and in this video I want to do a code review and talk to you about this project called Kill the Newsletter. So first of all, let's go over what Kill the Newsletter is and what it does. Then I will show you the code that makes it work, and I will even go over a little bit about how it is deployed and how the live version that you are looking at right now works. So let's start with what it is and what it does. So Kill the Newsletter is a service that converts emails and newsletters into atom feeds. And this is useful if you want to sign up for some newsletter and if you want to sign up for some content that is only available through a newsletter. The only way to get that content is a newsletter, but you prefer to read your news or whatever, your content, using RSS feeds. You're using something like Feedly or any other RSS feed reader. And it's kind of nice to do this because you have all your news in one place and you don't end up with an inbox in your email that is both news and work stuff and your family talking to you all in one place. It's nice to have this separation, or at least some people like that. So the way this works is you find some newsletter that is only available, you find some content that is only available through a newsletter, and then you come here to killthenewsletter.com and you give that the name of that newsletter so that people can, so that you know what you're signing up to, for you to remember what the title is. So let's say interesting content that's only available through a newsletter. And then you create an inbox. So what Kill the Newsletter is going to do is to give you an email address and an RSS feed. And the way this works is you sign up for the newsletter using this email address and you subscribe to the feed in your feed reader. And now anytime that the publisher of the newsletter sends an email to this address, the email is converted into an entry in the feed. And technically, this is not an RSS feed, it's an atom feed, but it turns out that most people refer to these as RSS feeds, even if they are atom. But anyway, the point is that you convert email into RSS entries. And that is what Kill the Newsletter does. That's the whole project. That's the entirety of the scope. It's a pretty simple project, but there are some interesting things going on here. And I guess the most interesting thing of all is that we need to have an email server that receives these messages and converts them into the feed. And that part is easy. XML is just text, but you do have to run an email server to receive the emails. So let's go to the code and start the code review. If you want to follow along, the URL for the code in the exact version that is covered in this video is down below in the description. You can go ahead and clone it from GitHub. So let's start with the meat of the project. This is where it all happens. It's written in TypeScript, and I will collapse the code and let's look at the structure and see where the main parts are. So we have here a web server, and that is what you see when you go to killthenewsletter.com. It has that form and this page and pretty much it. That's all there is to it. Then there is the email server. So this same project, this same file, when you run it, and I'm going to show you how to do that in a minute, but when you run this file, you will both start a web server and the email server that receives emails and converts them into entries in the feed. So both servers started with this single file. And you can see that the whole thing is quite simple. It's 300 lines of code to do the whole thing. And that is starting the web server, starting the email server, rendering the HTML, rendering the XML for the feed, all that in this one file. The whole project is in one file. So here is the code that adds an entry to the feed. We are going to look at how it does that in a minute. But the thing is, anytime the email server receives an email, it will call this function. Also, when you just create, for instance here, I just created this new feed, it already includes one entry, and the entry is this message. Just so you have this in case you need it, if you forgot the email address, but you have already signed up for the Atom feed, you have that. And I think it's just nice to create this feed with one single entry. So I create the feed empty, and then I call add entry to feed. So this function is called anywhere in the code base where I need to add an entry to a feed, which happens to be both in the email server when a message arrives and when you just created a new feed to put that initial message in there. And then this part of the code is just layouts. Let's expand this and take a look. So here we have HTML. So the layout for all the pages that you see, both the form and this message that appears when you successfully created an inbox, both of these have some common parts like the title and this logo. So the layout is here. It receives a content that is interpolated here. Now, there are a few interesting things about the way I'm doing layout here. The first is that I'm using template strings in JavaScript or in TypeScript. But anyway, I'm using template strings. I'm not using any templating language besides just template strings in JavaScript. It's super, super simple, but it allows me to have the whole material in one file. And I'm using some clever things here to have syntax highlighting, and I even have code formatting running here as well. So it looks like a template. It works like a template. It's embedded in JavaScript all in one place. It's super convenient to use. And when I say that I have things like formatting, it means that if I, for instance, change the indentation here, I can run my formatter and it will put the thing back in place. So you can see that the code is formatted using Prettier, which is the formatter that I use. It's down here. So that is how the layout works. It is a function that receives the content, and all the parts that are repeated in every page are here. And these are the standard things you would find, like a title and some meta tags, and some links to CSS. We are going to see the CSS in a minute. And then the parts that are common, like the title, the logo, and the footer. And that's how the layout works. It's just a template string in JavaScript. To get the syntax highlighting and the formatting thing, I have to use a tagged template string in JavaScript, and I tagged it with HTML, which by default, Prettier is going to pick this up and it's going to format. But also, I have this extension in Visual Studio Code that is called lit.html. And what it does is it picks up HTML tags in template strings and renders that with the HTML renderer in Visual Studio Code. So I get syntax highlighting, and I guess that's sort of it. I don't think I have auto-completion and other things that you would find when editing HTML in Visual Studio Code, but it's good enough for most cases just having syntax highlighting. So with the combination of this Visual Studio Code extension and Prettier, I can pretend that I have support for HTML in JavaScript, which I guess it's not pretending. I sort of have support for HTML in JavaScript. There are some things that don't work quite as well, but it is better than having another dependency, another extension, another language to work with, like a templating language proper. So I think that having it this way is very nice. Next, you can see here that I have some partials, some parts that are rendered into the layout. For instance, when you go to the main page, this one, I have a partial that is just the form. So here is that form. Again, I'm using the tagged HTML template string in JavaScript. So you might be wondering, what is this tag doing? Because in JavaScript, it's possible for the tag to process the template literal. It's possible to render that string into anything you want. Well, I am keeping things very simple. So the way that this template works, this tag works for the template, is that I'm using this package called the tagged template no-op. And the idea is that this is not processing the string in any way, which is, it's fine. I don't need any processing. What I'm doing is rendering this string and sending it with the web server that is right here. So I'm just calling these templates with as functions and getting strings back, and I don't need any processing with this HTML. So yeah, it's a no-op. And then here is the form, also pretty standard. This is the thing you see when you have created an entry, when you have created a new inbox and a feed. So you see this both here and as the first entry in this feed as well. In fact, I will show you. So the feed is now, this is an Atom feed, and there is an entry whose content is that page. So that is what this material is doing. So it's rendered both using the layout, and it's also rendered somewhere else to create a feed. And this somewhere else is right here. So here I have, again, I'm using the trick of HTML. In fact, this is not HTML, it's XML. But I couldn't find anything that would work like this is doing. So Prettier would not pick up XML. If I changed this to XML, it wouldn't work. Also, the Visual Studio Code extension I'm using, lit HTML, would not pick this up, so I wouldn't have syntax highlighting here. So I'm pretending that this is HTML. In fact, it's not, but it works. So I have here a simple Atom feed, and if you want to learn about the details, I'll not go over every detail that goes into an Atom feed, but I find that the documentation from W3C Atom feed, yeah, so this is where I learned everything. I don't think I even read the whole page, I just skimmed it and I found this example and I started with it. So it's a pretty simple XML format. There isn't much to it. And the only thing I have to do here is, well, this is boilerplate. Then here I say what is the source for this Atom feed. So it's pointing to itself. And this is just a link to the feed URL itself. And then there is another link to an alternate version in HTML of this same material. And I'm including this, but I'm pointing it back to killthenewsletter.com. And then there is an identifier. We are going to look at how we are generating these, a title for the feed, a subtitle in which I say what is the email and the feed URL. So if for some reason you have access to the subtitle, you will be able to get the feed email address as well as this. But if you already signed up for the newsletter in your feed reader, I think you know this URL. This URL is, by the way, this one, while the feed email is this one. So also this updated, I need to have this field updated every time I change the material of the feed. So anytime I add a new entry, I need to update this field. And then the author name is Kill the Newsletter. This is just a signature to say that this feed was created with Kill the Newsletter. And I guess you will see that in your feed reader depending on the feed reader you use. And you may be even able to sort and group all the newsletters that you signed up using Kill the Newsletter. But that depends on how you read your feeds. And then there is the function that returns another template, and that is just the contents of one entry. So I receive all the fields for one entry in the feed, and I generate part of XML. So this is just one partial that is rendered into the feed, and it will create one entry. So it's the same concept that is being used to generate the web pages. So this web pages, there is a template, and then there are all these other snippets of HTML rendered into the template. Same story with XML to generate the item feed itself. That's the story. Now let's go to some auxiliary functions that work with this templates and even some other things here on the web server and the email server. So I said that we need to create an identifier. I'm using this package crypto random string, and I'm generating an identifier that is 20 characters long, and that is only using these characters. And I wish there was in this project, in this crypto random string, a way to say that I want alphanumeric. I want characters that are just alphanumeric, either letters or numbers, but I don't allow for capital letters. I wish there was a way for me to abbreviate this and communicate this idea, because there are these presets, and you can say like numbers or letters, but then it includes letters that are capitalized, and I wanted things to be easy and simple with the identifiers, and I didn't want to have the capitalization distinguish between identifiers. So I prefer to just have lower letter identifiers. And I ran my hand over the keyboard and I typed this. So now I create identifiers that are 20 characters long and that are only lowercase letters or numbers. This is used in places like when I'm creating an entry, I need to have a unique identifier for that entry. And when I'm creating a feed, I also need a unique identifier for that. So those unique identifiers are created with this same function. There is only one shape of identifier in Kill the Newsletter, and that's how it's created. Now, there is the need in a few places to get the identifier from the entry here, this identifier. So we are going to see that I'm parsing the feed into a structure. I'm parsing it using this other project that allows me to use. I'm going to get into how that parsing works, but the point here is just that once you have parsed XML, you can use the DOM API, the same API you would use in the browser to navigate in the HTML structure, to navigate in the DOM. You can use that in XML as well to manipulate XML, to manipulate the feed. So I'm getting the identifier and I'm getting the content of that identifier. So this part here corresponds to getting this. And then with the text content, that corresponds to getting just this part. And of course, this is a template string, so this would be interpolated with an actual identifier. Let's look at how one of those looks. So yeah, it looks like this. It always starts with a universal resource name. I guess that's what URN stands for. And then that's a unique identifier for the project. So I know that this identifier was created with this project. And also it distinguishes all identifiers that were ever created in any other software in the world. But then there's the unique part of the identifier. So all identifiers start with these, but then this part is unique. This part was created using the create identifier function, and the get entry identifier will be able to get the text content, which is this part. So we have this part going this far, and then we split on the column. So we split into this, that, and that. And then we get the third, which is index 2. So we get this part, which is just the unique part of the identifier. And this is useful in some other parts of the code to be able to get this. Now is a function that gets the current date and transforms it into this format that is used, for instance, here in Atom feeds. So this ISO string is a format that is used in Atom feeds, and in a few places I need to get the current date, so that's what I do. And then there are several auxiliary functions to generate paths, both on the local machine, and we are going to see why that's relevant in a minute, but also URLs like these. And I do this because if you're running the project locally, you will get different names as your base URL. So you're not running on HTTPS killthenewsletter.com, but on HTTP localhost. And that would be different. So that's why this is a function that is parameterized this way. And the same thing for email and alternate path and alternate URL. And this is what is creating from an identifier alone. This is what is creating this whole string. So that's the URN function. And then these final two functions are using libraries to encode strings into HTML and XML. And these functions are called age and X because they are used in many places in the templates. It would be annoying to have to type a function name that was too long, but the idea here is if you don't trust some string to be clean, to not have any HTML or XML in it, maybe it's because it's the name typed by the user. For instance, this name could have some HTML tags in it. Maybe it is the content that is coming in an email and you don't trust whoever is the publisher that is sending the email to not have HTML in the body of the material. So you go through this function and it sanitizes it, encodes in a way that is safe to put that string into HTML or XML. There would be no extraneous characters, and that's a big deal, especially when you're receiving email. I guess about 90% of the work in this project was figuring out this line, because there are so many things that people send via email that are not even correct characters. They are like control characters that should not exist in a string. They are just code points that don't even map to a character, all sorts of crazy stuff. When you're dealing with incoming email, you really have to sanitize the input. It gets nasty really fast. So I found these two projects. One is called Sanitize XML String. I guess that's what it's called. Yeah, Sanitize XML String. And what this project does, it's a super niche project. It's not common at all. I think it has like a couple thousand downloads every month. But what it does is it takes the string and gets rid of all these weird characters. It only passes through the characters that are valid in XML, and that excludes control characters, all sorts of Unicode craziness. And then I also pass everything through this other function that is from a project called Entities. And where is it? Entities, yes, right here. So that's the project's name, the dependency. So what Entities does is it gets a string and encodes using escape code. So for instance here, when I am creating this content, I am passing that through the X function, and the entry that looked like, so there is the content of the entry. That's what we are looking at. And the content of the entry in this case is this part, the created function. So here I have a p tag, and the opening of the tag and the closing of the tag was encoded using the entities package. So that's what entities does. It converts this into this, for example. And it does, of course, a lot more to make sure that this is encoded and safe to include in HTML. And you can see that I'm passing the string that I get both through Sanitize HTML and through entities. I'm always sanitizing the string to exclude characters that are weird. And I'm going through Sanitize XML even when I am sanitizing HTML. That's nice. It's safe to do because HTML is similar to XML and the characters that are allowed are similar. So those are all the auxiliary functions. Now let's go to the web server and the email server and add entry to feed. So let's start with the web server. The way this works is, first of all, I am serving static files from the static directory. And that is my CSS, my images, my fonts, but also the feeds and the alternates. We'll get into that in a moment. Also, we need to parse the form that is submitted. So if you type something here and you click on the button, then we need to parse that data. So I'm using URL encoded, which is the default method that the browser uses when you submit a form. So I'm just saying to Express, for some reason, Express does not do this by default, but I'm saying to Express, please be aware of forms that are submitted and parse them and make them available on the request body, like so. So that's what this line is doing. And then I get, okay, so what is happening here is what happens when you just go to killthenewsletter.com? Well, you're effectively going to killthenewsletter.com/, right? That's effectively what is happening here. It's equivalent to the thing that I had like this. So these two things are equivalent. But effectively what is happening is you're going to this URL. What do you want to happen? Well, what I want to happen is to run this function. So this function has access both to the request and the response. And it's sending a response which is rendering the new inbox material, the new inbox HTML. So we looked at it before. It is the form. I am rendering the new inbox into the layout. We looked at the layout before. It looks like this. And that's what I'm sending as my response. And in case you haven't picked this up, we are using Express, the de facto web server for Node.js applications. And this is how you send HTML using Express. Now let's look at the thing that actually parses the form coming in and creates a new inbox. So first of all, the first thing you're going to notice is that I have to do some asynchronous work. And that is to write files to the file system and that sort of thing. Yeah, to essentially to manipulate files in the file system. That's what is happening. That is asynchronous. But because this is asynchronous, we have to handle errors properly. Because by default, Express is not aware of asynchronous functions. So if you have an asynchronous function that has done something asynchronous and then failed for whatever reason, then Express will not be aware of that. It may keep the connection open, waiting for the handler, this function, waiting for it to complete and answer, but it never will because it ran into an error, and Express will never do anything about that. So when you're running an asynchronous function using Express, then you must catch any errors. So here I have a try catch so that I am catching any errors, and you must call a next function with that error. So the function that you pass to Express to handle requests is usually a function with only two arguments, request and response. But in fact, Express allows you to have a third argument, which is a function. And if you call that function with an error, then Express will be aware that this is an error. It should do something about it. And it does. It responds with, I guess, a 500 saying something really weird happened. So if you are using asynchronous functions with Express, you must catch any errors and call the next function with it. This used to be the default way for asynchronous code to communicate errors before async await was a thing. So before you could just look for a promise that failed, that was not resolved. So, or that resolved into a failure. I don't know exactly the term that should be used here. But anyway, calling the next function used to be the way that things work before async await, but Express is still working with the old way, which is okay because Express is the de facto web server for Node.js applications precisely because it has been around forever and it works super nice. It's good in many ways, but it's not modern. So we have to do this. I'm also logging the error just so I have access to it if I need in the logs. Okay, so the way that this works is it's first looking at the request body, getting the name, and that is this field, the newsletter name. It's creating an identifier with the auxiliary function we looked at before, and then it is writing an atomic file. What's happening here? So this write atomic file is a dependency as well, write file atomic. And what this does is it guarantees that this write will complete before I go to the next line. And also that if there are multiple functions trying to write to this same path, that they will go one by one, that they will not go concurrently trying to write to the file, because if that happens, then you end up with a corrupted file. You end up with garbage. One function will start writing something, and then the next function will start writing their other thing, and then the first function will resume, and they will interleave, and the resulting file would not, it would probably even be correct XML. It may not even be correct characters if this function is in the middle of writing and the next one starts, but it stopped in the middle of a character. I guess it could corrupt the file in a way that wouldn't even be proper text. So what this is doing is serializing the writes to a file, which is not super relevant here because I'm guaranteed to have a unique path because this identifier is unique. I just created it. But everywhere else in this system, it makes sense to write atomically, so I'm doing it here as well. Specifically, it makes sense to write atomically in the case of emails arriving and I need to update the feed. The problem is that multiple emails may arrive for the same inbox at the same time. It's rare, but it has happened before. Actually, it has happened like 3 times before. So it's not that I'm super clever and I figured that this would be necessary from the start. It was actually a problem. Some people end up with their feeds corrupted. And I had to fix that by hand, going through their feeds and fixing the data. But then I figured what the problem was and I solved it in the code base. So now it's impossible to end up with garbage in the file for this reason. There may be other bugs, but this one is fixed. So yeah, the write file atomic guarantees that you are only writing to the file one process at a time. There will not be multiple emails coming in and making the feed break. So next, I render that text, that material that says this, because I'm going to use it twice, once in this page and also on the feed, as we saw. So I'm rendering it here so that I can reuse it. Now I'm using that auxiliary function that is here below, and we are going to look at how this works in a minute. But what this is doing is just adding this material as an entry, as the first entry in the feed. So yeah, it's creating an entry, rendering that XML for the entry. Note that it is calling X on the material, this material. It's calling X so that it is safe to use in XML. And yeah, so this adds this first entry in the feed. And with that, we are ready to respond. So we are responding to the browser, to the user, we render the layout and we render this material. We render this paragraph that looks like this paragraph. And then we also render the rest of the material that we had rendered before. So we send that as well. So that's what happens when you create a feed. And you can see that even in this resolution that makes everything very big in the screen that I use for recording videos, even in this resolution, the whole web server fits in one page, which I think is like fantastic. It's so simple, such a simple implementation. So yeah, that's the web server. Now let's look at the email server. So the email server is going to listen for emails, and when it receives an email, it will convert that into an entry in the Atom feed. First thing I'm doing is I'm using this library, this project called SMTP Server, and it's similar to Express in many ways. The API is similar, it's sort of similar. The ideas behind SMTP Server are very much from the school of thought from Express. And I kind of like that because there is a parallel between the way the web server works and the way the email server works. But the first thing I have to do is to disable some parts of the SMTP server, because usually if you just run an SMTP server, it would run in a mode that is for receiving emails from an email client like Outlook or the Mail app in macOS, and as if you were trying to send email to someone. That's what the SMTP server is usually for. You type your email on your machine and you click send, and that makes Mail in macOS or Thunderbird and so on. They send that email to an SMTP server that actually delivers to the recipient. So if you just run SMTP server, it will run in that mode, which is not what we want. We are in the exact opposite mode. We want to receive email, not to send email, not to relay email. So what I do is disable some commands that are for authenticating the sender, because I'm not talking to the sender. I'm not talking to some Outlook or Mail app trying to send email, and instead I'm receiving, I'm on the other end. So there is no idea of authentication, because what are you? You don't even have a password on my machine. I may not even know you, right? I'm receiving some email from somewhere on the web. So I disabled these commands that don't make sense. I guess start TLS could make sense, but most SMTP servers, I guess, don't use or don't require start TLS, and maintaining TLS keys for an SMTP server could be kind of annoying. So I'm just disabling that. I'm saying, if you're trying to send email to me, beware, I don't know how to speak TLS, which I guess is kind of bad from a security perspective, but we are talking about newsletters here. So I guess it's kind of okay. So let's look at this function. What this function does is, well, that's the function that runs when I received an email. So to some extent, it's similar to this function here that runs when I receive a submission from a form. In spirit, they are the same. So here, the stream and the session are similar to the request and the request data that you would get from request body. So it's similar to that, but instead here we are talking about the body of the email and the data that comes in the headers, like who is it from, who is it to, what is the subject, and so on. But the idea is the same. We have a request coming in and we need to extract the data from the request. And there is also the callback, which is similar to our next guy here that we looked at before. But instead it is for an SMTP server. But it is similar in spirit. And if, for instance, if you catch an error, you have to call the callback with an object for the exception, for the error. And the only difference, I guess, is that the callback must be called even if everything succeeded. And in that case, you don't call with any arguments, but you have to call it to signal that the function is over processing the data, that we are done. So the structure of this function on data is similar. It is also asynchronous, but similar to what happened with Express. In the case of asynchronous functions, SMTP server doesn't know how to handle asynchronous functions, so we need to wrap our whole body with a try-catch, catch the error, and call callback with that error. So it's the same structure you can see here in Express and in SMTP server for exactly the same reasons. So here in the catch, I'm not only logging the error, but I'm also doing some other thing, just one other thing. I'm also consuming the whole stream of data. So if the body of the email has not been read entirely yet, I am reading that body of the email, but I'm not doing anything with the contents. And the only reason I have to do this is that that's another condition for SMTP server to know that we are done processing. So I have to call the callback and I have to read the whole string with the whole body of the email. If I don't do that, then email server is not going to respond to whoever is connecting to the sender. It's not going to respond, it's just going to hang. So yeah, that's what this is doing. Now, let's look at the body here. So what is happening here is I'm first parsing the body of the email using mail parser, and this already consumes the stream. So it's very rare that the stream will not be consumed and that we would have to run this line. Or actually that this line would do anything besides just, yeah, okay, I got it, it's already consumed, the stream is over. Because mail parser would have to fail for that to happen, you know. The only case in which the stream would not be consumed would be if the mail parser failed, which I don't think ever happens. Mail parser is super stable. But anyway, mail parser is another library, and it's developed by the same people behind SMTP server. The two libraries are kind of designed to go together, and they are all part of this bigger project that is, I forget the name. Yeah, that is called Node Mailer. That is all part of the same project. So it's super stable. It's the de facto library for working with email in Node.js. So I don't think that mail parser ever does not consume the stream. But in any case, we do have this line here if that happens. Okay, so that is going to parse the email and it's going to generate this email object. So what it means to parse an email, it's the same thing as parsing like HTML or parsing anything else. The email has some headers with things like the subject, the sender, the recipient. So it's going to parse the text of the email and create an email object that gives us easy access to all these parts of the email. So for instance, when we look at the content, what is the content of the newsletter? Well, it depends, because an email may have an HTML part or a text part, or maybe both, because your email client, and when I say email client, you can think of Outlook Express on your machine or the Mail app in macOS. So it's not like Gmail. It's some app that you run on your machine. Or I guess in this case, for this example here, in particular, the content, I guess even Gmail applies. So your email client may be able to display HTML, or it may not be able to display HTML and only able to display text. And you may even be able to configure, if you want, your email client to show you HTML or plain text. So email may contain both or just one of these two, and I guess neither if your body is empty, but that is rare because you're sending an email with no content. But yeah, so the content here may be HTML or it may be text. So I have to check. And in the email object, I have the HTML field that may be a string, or I guess it may be null, I don't remember. Or it may be false. So I'm checking, is it a string? In case it is, then give me the HTML. Otherwise, there is this auxiliary function in mail parser that I think is super nice. It's not an auxiliary function, it's an auxiliary field. So this field will be the text of the email converted into HTML. So if you have things like 2 new lines in your plain text email, I guess it will convert that into paragraphs. I have to check to be sure, but I think it will convert that into paragraphs. So it's similar to parsing Markdown in some ways, but it's, I guess, a lot simpler than parsing Markdown. It's just converting some very basic formatting into HTML. So that's what I'm using here because I want my content to always be HTML. So what I'm doing is I'm checking if I have HTML. If so, then give me HTML. Otherwise, give me the text as HTML. And if you don't have even that, so this is an expression here that reads as, give me the text as email. But if it's undefined and you don't have even that, then it means the body is empty. The email has no body, it has no content. Then I just default to an empty string. If you don't know this operator, it's somewhat new to JavaScript and to TypeScript. And what it does is, if you have material on the left, then that is the result of the expression. But if the material on the left is undefined, then this is the default value you should use. So when paired with the ternary operator, I think this expression reads very well. It is quite clear that this is the preferred option, this is the second, and this is the third option. Now, the next thing is we are going to look at all the recipients in the email. Why do I say all the recipients? Well, because you can be sending an email to multiple people. It just go to the to field in your email client and you type in multiple people's name, and then you're sending email to multiple people. So I have to look at each one, and if I have to look at each one because it's possible that one of them is a Kill the Newsletter client. It's possible that multiple of them are Kill the Newsletter clients, and it's possible that none of them are Kill the Newsletter clients. So I have to look at all of them and check. Okay, so the next line here is getting the email address and matching that with a regular expression. So the regular expression is first begin and end because I don't want to have anything besides the thing I'm matching. This is a named group in a regular expression. So this is the regular expression that I'm really matching here on this part. But then I'm giving this whatever this matches, I'm giving it this name, identifier. And then I can refer to this part of the regular expression, to this part of the material that was matched as the identifier part of the match groups. And then on the right of the @ sign, I want to match the email domain. So in this case, it would be this, killthenewsletter.com. So if you're sending email to Kill the Newsletter, but your target is someone who's not even a killthenewsletter.com address, then I'm going to discard your email, okay? Because I don't care about you. But let's see how this works. So first of all, I'm going to check, did I match? Because if I didn't match, if this doesn't match, it means you're not a it may mean you're not even sending the email to @killthenewsletter.com. So what I do is just continue. In other words, I go to the next one of the addresses. And if there are none, then I get out of this loop and go to callback. So if I get to the next line, I am sure that I have something on the left that reads like a bunch of letters. So this part of the regular expression is saying any letter at all, 0 to 9, A to Z, including capital letters, which are not included in identifiers. But anyway, this regex would match. And I want one or more of them to the left of the @ sign. So if I have, for instance, this email address, then this part is going to match the \w+. And this is going to be the identifier. So I know that in the matches groups, there will be the identifier named here. And because lower letters are indistinguishable from uppercase letters in email addresses, or at least that's how I want to handle them, I'm calling to lowercase. Then I call add entry to feed which is similar to what we did here when we created a new feed to add that first entry. So I add entry to feed, similar here, add entry to feed with the identifier that, to what feed you may be thinking? Well, to the feed that we just got here. So if the person is in the Kill the Newsletter system, then this function is going to succeed. And if the person is not there, then this function is going to succeed as well, but not do anything. But it's safe to call this function even with a feed identifier that does not exist. But if it doesn't exist, then it will add an entry with, well, the identifier for the entry I just create on the spot. The title of the entry is going to be the subject of the email, and I pass that through the X function to make it safe for XML. The from field, the author field, is the text of the from field from the email. So you can see a mapping here. And then the content of the entry is going to be the content of the email. So you can see a mapping. The email title turns into the feed subject. The email, the other way around. The email subject turns into the feed title, the entry title. The email author, the from field, becomes the atom feed entry author, and then the content maps to the content. If something goes wrong with this, then I want to log that. I don't want the whole thing to fail, so I'm not going to call back with an error, okay? Because usually this function is not supposed to run into any errors, but it may. And in case it does, then I want to log this so that I can go and look at the logs and see what's going on and fix the bug. This is another way of doing a try-catch when you have an asynchronous function. Instead of writing try-catch, I could write try-catch. But it would be annoying to have one extra level of indentation. I don't want to have this extra level of indentation right here. It would be annoying. So instead, I just do it like this. That's only possible because this is an asynchronous function. Okay, so finally, let's look at add entry to feed and see how that works. So it receives the identifier for the feed and the entry as a string. It has already been rendered into a string. So first of all, it will get the feed path and it will try to read that file. This feed path is one of those auxiliary functions that creates a path for that identifier. But then it tries to read that file. If the file exists, then this is going to be assigned to the variable text. But if the file does not exist, then this will throw. And then I catch and return. Well, this will throw. And then when I catch, I just say return, which means stop executing this function. So as I said, if the feed does not exist, then this function will succeed, but it will not do anything. That's exactly what we want. Because if you're sending email to someone that is not in the system, to an identifier that does not exist in the system, it's fine. It is just discarded. And that's what this is doing here. And you may be thinking, well, why don't you say like access to figure out if the file exists or even exists? I guess there is a function that looks like this, except that I'm using the file system version that works with promises, and I don't think it exists with promises. But the point here is you could check that the file exists before trying to read it. Well, that's a bad idea, because the file may exist when I try to determine. So it may exist at this point, but then it's deleted. And in this point, it does not exist anymore. Also, it's a bad idea because I'm doing the check twice. So I'm going to the file system and doing stuff twice. But the point here is, if you want to read a file from the file system and you are not 100% sure that the file is there, what you do is you try to read it anyway and handle the error case. You do not check the file for existence and then read it. That's just the more correct way of doing this. So now this is the bulk of the work, okay? So this is the most complicated function in Kill the Newsletter. What it's doing is it's taking the text of the XML file, parsing it using JS DOM, which is a library capable of parsing XML and working with it as if you were in the browser. So you can use the DOM APIs from the browser that most people already know. It's super convenient to use and super capable too. And you can use that API to work with XML. So I'm in the beginning here, I'm parsing the text of the feed, the raw material, the text of the feed, turning it into this object using JS DOM. I'm going to mangle with that for a while. And when I'm done, I'm going to take this feed and write it to a file. So there is this whole part here that I'm going to highlight that is manipulating the feed to add the entry. And then finally, it will write the contents of the feed back to that path that we figured in the beginning. So the idea is that I'm reading the file, I am making changes to it, and then I'm writing the feedback into the file. Note how I'm using write file atomic here to get rid of those problems of concurrency, of multiple emails arriving at the same time, as we discussed before. So now let's look at how we are changing the feed to add an entry. Well, first of all, I'm getting the document, and that is JS DOM is returning an object that contains the document, contains the DOM, and that's similar to what you would do in the browser. You would say, for instance, here in the console, you could say window document to get a hold of the document. Well, that's what I'm doing with the feed. I'm doing window document to get a hold of the feed document that I can use the DOM API, things like query selector, to manipulate XML. Okay, so here I have to do a bunch of things. First, I have to update that updated field we looked at before. So in the feed, there is this updated field that I need to update every time that I add an entry or anytime that the feed has changed in any way. So this is what I do here in this first part. I get a hold of the updated field, and then I update it with now. There is a chance that the updated field is not there. This only happens if there is a bug in the system. The only case in which this could happen if there is a bug in the system and the updated field is for some reason not there. It may happen if there is a bug that just corrupted the XML, which has happened before, as I said. It has happened before when I was not writing the file atomically. So it's a possibility that the field isn't there, and if it's not, then I throw an error. So that's one of those cases, those rare cases in which add entry to feed could throw an exception. And that only happens when there is a bug. Okay, so next, I have to add the entry to the feed. So that's what this part is doing here. So it's getting, there are two possibilities. The feed, there are two different ways that we could add an entry to a feed. The first possibility is I need to find the first entry in the feed, and I will add my new entry on top of it, before it. But there is also a chance that there are no entries in the feed. Why is that? We'll look at why in a moment. It's down here. But just trust me, there is a possibility that there will not be any entries in the feed. So there are two ways to add an entry to a feed. First is I'll check, can I find a first entry? If I cannot, then I will just add an entry before the end of the whole feed. Otherwise, if I can find a first entry, then I will add my new entry before the first entry. So for instance, in this feed, if I were to add a new entry here, I would add it right here, right before the entry. So this entry is the first entry, and my new entry would go right before here. This before begin, that's what it does. And if there are no entries, then I would just get the feed, and that is the whole thing that starts here, ends there. I would just do this whole thing, of course, without the entry, because this field would be empty, and I would just insert before the end. So I would insert right here where the cursor is. That's where I would add an entry in case there are no entries in the feed. Okay, and then there is this other part here. We'll get to that in a moment. But why would the feed have no entry? Well, the problem is feeds cannot be too long. They cannot be too big. If they are, then there are some RSS clients that would not even read it because the file is too big. Also, I have to pay for storage for Kill the Newsletter, so I would have to pay a big bill if I have to store every entry forever. So I check the size of the feed after I have added the new entry. If the size is greater than 500 kilobytes, then I'm going to delete the last entry, the oldest entry, the entry at the bottom. I'm always adding new entries to the top, so I delete the bottom entry. So how this works is I get the last type, the last of type, so the last entry. This is the last entry. If there are no entries to delete, then I have to stop, so I break this loop. But otherwise, I continue, I remove that entry, and I am going to go into this part when I go into this as well. So I'm going to get that in a minute. But the idea is I'm just going to delete the last entry until I am under 500 kilobytes. And that's why there may be no entries in a feed, because I deleted all entries. If there is just one entry that is huge, this is super improbable. I don't think this has ever happened in the system, but if there is one entry that is big, it's bigger than 500 kilobytes, that single entry will be wiped out, it will be removed, and the feed will be empty, no entries at all. So I always have to check that case as well. And also the feed may be empty when you're creating it and you are adding that first entry. So in the creation here, we have this add entry to feed, and this feed is also guaranteed to be empty every time. So I always have to check if the feed is empty, and I have to add an entry to it differently. Okay, so now let's finally look at this. What is happening here? Well, when you add an entry to a feed, it's optional, but it's common to have that same material available as HTML in some URL. So if you receive, for instance, this in your email, well, actually in your Atom feed, then there should be a version of this also as plain HTML somewhere on the web. And some RSS clients would not even work if you don't have this alternate available. This is what it's called. It's an alternate. It's the same material, so this same thing, but available in some URL. So for instance, in this URL right here. Okay, so let's go there and I will show you. It's just that material that I highlighted, available as HTML somewhere on the web. And I want to store this. I want to have this available to the user. I want to have this available for every entry. So I write the material from the entry, the contents of the entry. I get the contents of the entry. I decode that XML. So I'm now turning things like these back into an opening bracket. So I'm turning that back into this, turning this back into this, and writing that material to, so in this place, I'm writing that material to a file that will be served in this URL because it is using this path and because Express is just serving static files. So you can see here in the static files that this is in the alternates folder. There are a bunch of HTML files with this kind of material. And in case you haven't realized thus far, the way storage works in Kill the Newsletter is the file system. I don't have any sort of database engine, no third-party services like Amazon S3, no nothing. It's just plain files in the static folder. They are served because they are in the static folder. The feeds are here. The alternates are here. The design is super simple. Okay, so we are back here into the function that adds entry to feeds. Okay, here we are. So we are writing that material to a file so it's available for people here. And when we find that we need to remove an entry from the feed because the feed is too large, then we also remove the alternate because I'm paying for storage for this thing. I don't want to pay for storage for an HTML file that is never accessed anymore because the entry that points to it is deleted. And then, yeah, so this is what this part is doing, and then this is just writing the feed, the resulting feed after all these changes. Okay, and there are a few things that I want to point out before I move out of this file. So let's look at, for instance, these two lines. I want to talk about them. So these things that we discussed from here to here, and then this as well, they are just setting up the web server and the email server, but they are not telling the servers to actually start. So these are the lines that make the server actually start. And now the last thing I want to point out about this file is this section right here. So what is happening here is I am getting the configuration for Kill the Newsletter from the variables in the environment variables. So There are different ways to run this. One, of course, is in production. That's what is running on killdnewsletter.com. But you are encouraged to deploy your own version to other web hosts if you want. And also, of course, you need to run this on your local machine. And that's for testing and development. So I am getting environment variables, and if they exist, then they set the values for these variables. But if they do not exist, then I use again that operator that detects if the thing on the left does not exist, then assign the thing on the right. So I have the false value for all the environment variables, which means that if you don't set environment variables at all, then you can run this thing locally. And that's what I'm going to show you how to do. So if you just clone this out of GitHub, again, link below, you can npm install, and after that you can npm run develop, and it will start the development server, which is both the web server and the email server, using the file we just looked at. So npm run develop, and the first time it loads, it cannot connect to the server, but then you reload it and it should work. Okay, so here it is. Now we are running Kill the Newsletter locally. And the reason for the environment variables is so that now that we are running locally, we change some things. For instance, local newsletter example. Now you can see that the host here for the email and also this part of the address, they're different. And yeah, and there are other differences as well. And you can even customize things like what happens when you click on report an issue. By default, it will send an email to me. But if you are deploying this to your own server and you want to change that to be your email, you can. And for now, that's all for the index file, but there are still other interesting things to look at in this project. So I want to move on to the test file. So there is a pretty good coverage in QD Newsletter. I am covering all the edge cases as well. Things like a feed that is too big and you need to remove some of the entries, or even an entry that is so long that you need to remove it. So let me collapse everything. First thing I want to point out about this file is this parallel. I think it's super neat that there is a parallel between the web server and the email server here. So there is a web server and an email server on the index file we looked at before. And on the test file, there is a web client and an email client. So there is this parallel, the server and the clients. And the web client and the email client are using other libraries, Axios and NodeMailer, but they are just that. They are clients for HTTP and for email. So the way that these tests work is that we are exporting the email server and the web server. You can see here export. The reason we are exporting is only because we need to be able to make actual requests for the web, from the web client to the web server, from the email client to the email server. So there is no mocking, there is no pretending. We are actually running the servers and we are actually making requests with the clients. And so we have some setup here. We create an Axios client with this base URL, and we also create a NodeMailer transport with this URL. And then after all the tests run, we close the web server and the email server. So what we are doing while testing is we spin up the servers, we run a bunch of tests, they are here, and we are going to go into them. And then you close the servers over here. So let's go to the actual tests. And then I will also cover here some of the auxiliary functions. The first test is really simple. It's just testing the idea of creating a feed. So I have this auxiliary function to create feeds. We are going to look into that soon. And then after you create the feed, remember that creating the feed just gives you the URL for it. So right after creating the feed, I get the feed, which means I actually make a request to get this URL. And then I find the entry in the feed that I just created. I also test the alternate, the thing I explained before, the raw HTML material from an entry. I check that that is there as well. And so that's what the get alternate auxiliary function is doing. And then I test some things in the feed. I'm doing this request to get the feed, and I am parsing using JS DOM. So it's a similar business to what we did on the server. Again, there is a parallel. On the server, here in index, we used JS DOM to parse the feed so we would be able to add an entry to the feed. On the tests, we parse the feed so we can make sense of it and check that it contains the things that we want to be there. So we expect the title of the feed to have a certain material, and so there is a paragraph with the material of sign up for the newsletter with, which is this part, and so on and so forth. So we test the feed, an entry in the feed, and the alternate, which is pretty much all there is to it. And this is the test for when you create a feed, but there are plenty of tests for when you receive an email. And there are several different things that may happen, and they are all sort of similar, but not quite exactly the same. So the first thing we test is that the updated field is updated. Remember that that's the field in the feed that needs to be updated every time the feed changes. So the way to test this is, first, I get a hold of the updated field before, and I get a hold of the updated field after I make, I actually send an email. So the way this works is, I create a feed, I get the feed before sending the email, and then I send the email using the email client, the NodeMailer email client. I actually send an email to the email server we spun up here on this part when we started the server. And then I get the feed again, and I compare the updated fields before and after. That's how it works. I also test a lot of variants on the content. So you may have HTML content, you may have only text content. And these tests, you can see, they look very similar. The main difference is here on the email that is sent. One has HTML and the other has text and no HTML. So it will go into that case of add entry to feed. So not here, it will go here. It will go into this case in which you parse the text and you transform it into HTML. This test will do that. And then there are tests for emails that only have text, but the text contains some new lines, and you expect new lines to turn into paragraphs, and you expect URLs to turn into links that you can click, and so on and so forth. I also have tests for material that is invalid. Remember, I told you how it is super hard to get this line right, or at least it was super hard for me to get this line right, and I looked at several libraries that work with XML, and none of them could get this right. I worked with the authors of some of them to fix the problems, but still, super hard to get this right because it is hard to tell what is a valid XML string. And that is until you learn how to do it. If you read the specs and everything and you learn how Sanitize XML String works, it's actually just one line of code. But that line of code, let me tell you, oh boy, it's hard to write. But anyway, so I added tests over time. I would see that with the logging, I have logs that show me the issues that happen. So remember here we have, for instance, this point. We have some logging of errors. So I was looking at the logs over time, over years of running Kill the Newsletter, and I noticed what was going wrong, and I fixed it. So I put some of these in the tests. Some invalid characters, and for instance, this is a control character. It means backspace, which is invalid when it's invalid in XML, absolutely invalid in XML. So I had to make sure that I was removing it. That's part of the job of this library, but yeah, until I found this library, this was breaking Kill the Newsletter. So that sort of thing. And also missing fields. When you're missing the from field, then you're exercising that line that defaulted to the empty string. So I'm testing all these variants. And when you're receiving email from the internet, you are receiving all kinds of junk. So you have to test for everything. I also test here truncation, so that part of the algorithm that detects if the feed is too big, if it's bigger than 500 kilobytes. So I'm testing this here by sending big text. So now I'm saying repetition number 1, for instance, and I'm saying that 10,000 times, which means it's a big string. It will reach the 500 kilobytes limit, and it will truncate the last entry. And I check that the last entry is no longer there. And I also test, so this is, I expect the content to not be there anymore. And here I expect the alternate to also not be there anymore. And entries that are too big, that's when a single entry is more than 500 kilobytes, so it will get truncated, and then the feed will be empty. But yeah, that is all about the tests. Now let's talk about the auxiliary functions. They are pretty simple. They are just, for instance, to create feed, I use the web client and I send a request that is a post request. So it functions as if you were in the browser and you saw the form and you typed something into it and you hit submit. So that's what this part is doing. It's pretending to hit submit, and it is then getting this page here, and it's parsing that page using JS DOM so that it can get this part, or actually this part. It gets this part. It does a query selector for code, which is this part, and then it gets the text content, splits at the @ sign, which is this, and then gets the first part, which is this part. So that's the create feed is doing two things. It is both creating the feed, but also returning the identifier for the feed that was created. And because it's doing all these requests, it has to be asynchronous. That's why it returns a promise. The get feed function, similar story. It's making an HTTP request using the web client, parsing the result with JS DOM, and then parsing, and then returning the document. So when you say get feed, you pass the identifier and you get back a JS DOM object, a document really, that you can just use the DOM APIs on. And then get alternate, it is even simpler. It is just getting the alternate and parsing that using JS DOM. So you get back a document fragment, but you can use the same APIs, the same DOM APIs. You can use the query selector function, for instance. And that's all. That is the test suite. Next, let's take a look at the material in the static folder. So there is the alternate folder and the feeds folder. Those are the folders that they start empty. And then when you create a feed, it will create a file in here, which will be served by the server just as a static file. So there is no other storage mechanism. Those two folders contain XML and HTML. That's it. Then there are the fonts. The fonts were installed using npm. So I kept things very simple. I did not use any asset bundler, no Webpack, no nothing. But I wanted to use these typefaces, and the simplest way to get them was to just npm install these packages called the typeface pt mono and pt sems. But I didn't want them to live in the node modules directory, so I moved them out of the node modules directory and put them here. They are actually versioned with the source code. So if you go to GitHub, you can see that there are actually the packages. There is a copy of the packages in this repository, and I can get the fonts really nice. The packages were actually designed to be used with things like Webpack, but I am hacking this and not using it with Webpack. I'm just literally importing the CSS, and it happens to work. So then there is some icons, some images, and then there is the CSS, which I want to show because this is it. I think that this is kind of good looking. It's not like lasers and what, but I guess that's why I think it's good looking. It's not like lasers and colors, and it's just simple and functional. And yeah, you see it. If you need this, if you are into this space, if you're the kind of person who knows that you want to convert your email newsletters into atom feeds, you definitely look at this, you see the icon, you fill in the form, you get this message, and you know what to do. And it's so simple, and it doesn't have to be complicated. No CSS preprocessors, no fancy stuff, just keeping it simple. I import the packages with the fonts that I want. So you see, it's simple, and yet it is sophisticated in its simplicity, because it's using custom typefaces, and it looks generally good. But yeah, the CSS is just saying what the font size should be, aligning everything to the center, putting some space around things, removing the nasty default links in blue and underline. And then I use my font face for code. I set some sizes for some parts of the page, like the header and the footer. And I change the input so that it looks better, for instance, with this rounded corners. And that's all. That's the CSS. No big deal. Then there are yet more things that I want to talk about. Let's briefly go over this. So what this is doing is, anytime I push to GitHub, it will check out the repository, install Node, of course, but then it will run the tests with this npm command that installs and runs the test. And not only it installs, but it installs in CI, or continuous integration mode. So it will install the npm dependencies that are in package.lock.json, not the dependencies that are in package.json. So it will not try to update dependencies, fix conflicts, none of that. If there are problems, it will just fail right away without trying to fix anything. And then I am doing some setup to deploy. So this is a GitHub action that works as a CI server, a continuous integration server. So it installs everything, it runs the tests, and if the tests pass and I am deploying, I am pushing to master, it will deploy. And I will show you how the deployment works in a minute, but it's super nice because it is just push to deploy. If I push to master, it deploys. Then there is some configuration here for VS Code, so you can just hit Command-Shift-B and it will start the development server. There is also some configuration for Docker, and that is because some people wanted to deploy this with Docker, so I wrote some configuration real quick, but in fact, I don't use it myself. But anyway, it's there for people who want it. And with that, we are ready to move on. Oh, I guess I'll just briefly mention the configuration for TypeScript before I move on to the final part. And the configuration for TypeScript is just, I'm compiling to the latest version that Node.js can run, and that is ECMAScript 2019. I'm using the CommonJS module system because there are some packages that do not support the new default, which will be not CommonJS modules, but ECMAScript 6 modules. 6. I'm not sure. I don't know if it's ECMAScript 6 or 7 or 8, but yeah, the newer ECMAScript modules. So there are some packages that don't support, so I have to use CommonJS. And source map doesn't even make sense anymore. I guess this is legacy from before because I am never actually compiling, and we'll see how that works in a moment. But I'm never actually compiling the TypeScript to JavaScript. I guess it's safe to remove this line. We'll see. And then there is strict, because I want to check for nulls and whatnot. And yes, module interoperability. I don't know how to say that word. And that is, again, just because there are some dependencies that do not work in TypeScript unless you have this enabled, because they are ECMAScript modules. So I have to work with both CommonJS and ECMAScript for now while this transitioning is happening. I believe that Node.js will transition to ECMAScript, and this will no longer be a problem. We'll see. Okay, so now let's talk about the last thing that I want to cover, and that is how deployment works. So let's look at package.json, and we'll also look at main YAML. And so package.json is the configuration for the project. Main YAML is the configuration for the GitHub action that runs the tests and deploys. So first I have a bunch of scripts, and the way that you start the server in production is with tsnode. Tsnode is a wrapper around Node, the command line tool. So when you say things in the command line like node, so tsnode is a wrapper for that runs TypeScript directly. So under the hood, what it's doing is compiling TypeScript to JavaScript and then running the JavaScript. But you don't have to see the realized JavaScript file, which is convenient. It's one file less that you have to look at in your IDE. So tsnode is like Node, the command line tool, but it runs TypeScript. And I say dot because my file is named index. So that's the default. And then to develop, I'm using a couple of projects. I'm using OpenCLI, which opens this URL both in macOS and in Windows or even in Linux. So it's a platform-independent way of opening this URL. And that's nice because when you say npm run develop, it will open the thing for you. And yeah, it's kind of annoying that you have to refresh, but that's just because right next we are running the thing that compiles the code, runs the code, and that is going to listen for changes and reload. So we cannot run this second because this just hangs while you are developing. So we have to open this URL in the browser, and then the user has to, or the developer has to hit reload to get the actual project running. But anyway, so now NodeMon it's like Node, but it monitors. So what this does is it monitors for the files, for changes in files in the file system, and it will check If the file has changed, then it will stop and restart the server, which is nice because when you are developing, you can just change the file, hit save, and you can see the changes immediately on the server, on the browser. You don't have to stop and restart and stop and restart. So we have the call to nodemon. We are listening to changes on the Typescript files, and when a change is detected, it will run this command, the tsnode dot, which is what we use to start a server. To run the tests, we first check for the styles. We run prettier to check that we have formatted our TypeScript and CSS, and then we run jest, which runs the test suite we looked at before. And here is declared all the dependencies. We already looked at all of them in one way or another, except for a few that are related to deployment, and we'll get to that in a moment. And then there is a configuration here for jest. It's using ts-jest, which is the jest equivalent of tsnode. So when you're running node on the command line, you have to run tsnode instead. And when you would like to run jest on the command line, you can just run jest. But you have to configure it to use this preset for ts-jest. And then it's able to pick up the TypeScript files and run the TypeScript tests in them. So that's why the test file is written in TypeScript just fine. And then the test environment is Node because by default, jest would run pretending to be a browser. And we want to pretend it to be a Node server, or actually to run in a Node mode. So now let's talk about deployment, the final thing. So the way Kill the Newsletter is deployed is I run a machine on DigitalOcean. It's the cheapest plan they have. It's $6 per month, $5 for the machine and $1 for backup. And the reason why I'm doing that is that Kill the Newsletter takes a lot of bandwidth. So the storage isn't all that much. I guess it's like 5 to 10 gigabytes of space. I don't know exactly the number because I introduced the alternates recently, and the alternates take a lot of space effectively. I think they doubled the amount of space that it's required. But the RSS clients download RSS feeds a lot, very often, to check for changes, right? So I have to serve these files a lot. We are talking about almost 500 gigabytes worth of data every month. And if I were to use anything besides DigitalOcean, it would get expensive really fast. I tried. In fact, I have built Kill the Newsletter again and again. The same code base, I have rebuilt it in Ruby, in Go, and using all different technologies. I tried to use Amazon S3. I tried to use Backblaze, not for backups, but for storage. They have a storage thing as well. They are most known for backups, but they also have a storage thing. And it gets expensive really fast. We're talking about $50 per month as opposed to the $5 that I'm paying. So the biggest sell for DigitalOcean is not exactly that it runs the project, but that the bandwidth is cheap. We are talking about $5 per month for the machine, and it comes with 1 terabyte of transfer in the plan. And after that, you have to pay extra, but it's 1 terabyte, which is almost double what I need. Also, because DigitalOcean hosts both the server and the files, I don't have to go to the files to make updates. So when I was using S3, I would have to go to Amazon S3 to do this part, and then go there again to do this other part. And that gets expensive really fast because we are talking about going to the object twice for every email that I receive. And we receive a lot of emails. So DigitalOcean is the cheapest option. It also allows me to be super simple with the storage mechanism because it's just files in the file system. I love that simplicity. So we are deploying to DigitalOcean. The downside of deploying to DigitalOcean is that we have to configure everything. I boot up an Ubuntu machine and I have to configure everything from there. So I have this tool configured. It's called PM2. I guess it's Process Manager 2 or something like that. And PM2 takes care of the whole deployment and installing everything with just this much of configuration. And yeah, it was a lot of time to learn and set everything up, but it's one screen worth of code. And it's not that hard of a code. So I'm super happy with this setup. Let's go over what's happening here. First, I am saying what the process manager should run when it runs the project. So when I say start the project, what should it run? Well, it should run two different processes. One is this. That's just the app. We looked at this. So it's the Kill the Newsletter app, and you just run npm start. And these are some environment variables that work for the deployment, the deployed version. So these are environment variables that are picked up here on the top, and they are what set up this for, that sets Kill the Newsletter for running on killthenewsletter.com. So it changes the domain and the ports and everything. So it's now running, for instance, in port 25, which is the port in which you listen to emails, but you are not allowed to run on this port on your local development machine unless you have set everything up, or unless you are running on a Mac, because the later versions of macOS allow you to run things on port 25. But previous versions would require super user for that, which would be super annoying. So anyway, these are environment variables, and that's the process that runs the app. But there is one thing between the app and the network, the thing that actually responds and to HTTP requests, and that is a so-called reverse proxy. It's what essentially takes care of the lock on the address bar. That's what it's doing. It's setting up TLS. The main reason why I use a reverse proxy is for TLS. So I'm using this tool called Caddy, and Caddy, it's a tool that can do many things, but I'm using it mainly for being a reverse proxy and taking care of TLS. So a request comes into Kill the Newsletter. The first thing that responds to the request is Caddy. Caddy takes care of the TLS part, so the lock on the address bar, and then it sends the request to Kill the Newsletter. And Kill the Newsletter does this, does the job of creating a newsletter and so on and so forth, and then responds to Caddy, which forwards the response to the browser. So you can see that Kill the Newsletter is actually running on port 8000, which is not the default port for HTTP or for HTTPS. And that is because we are running Caddy on those ports. The way Caddy is installed, I think, is super neat. There is this package called Caddy npm, which installs Caddy as an executable that you can just run. It's actually a Go project, so you would have to install it in some other way, but it is packaged in an npm package. So I think it's super nice to just install it this way. So let's look at the configuration for Caddy. Also super simple. So if you are requesting killthenewsletter.com, then I'm using this reverse proxy feature and going to localhost 8000, which is where we're running the Kill the Newsletter server. And mind you that this is only in production, okay? So in your local machine, there is no reverse proxy. On your local machine, there is no TLS key. And in your local machine, you're running on HTTP, though my browser doesn't show it to me. But yeah, you are not running on HTTP, yes. No lock. On localhost, no lock. Okay, so Caddy is our reverse proxy. How do we set the whole thing up to begin with? Because in the machine, in the DigitalOcean machine, there is no node installed. How do I bootstrap the process? And also, how do I know where to deploy to, right? When I say deploy, where am I deploying? So here in the GitHub action, I am setting up an SSH key. We'll get into that later. But then I'm running Npm Run Deploy. And what Npm Run Deploy is doing is just calling PM2 to deploy something using this configuration, the package.json configuration. So it looks at this part. And this is where I tell it to deploy and how to set things up. So there is only one deployment target, which is production. You could have different deployment targets like staging, testing, or client review, and so on and so forth. I only have one, production. In the machine, I am doing the insecure thing of running as root because it's simpler. I am treating this machine as disposable. I can very easily set up a new machine and then copy the contents of these folders or grab it from a backup and run a new machine and destroy the old one. So I don't care about running as root because there is nothing for me to protect besides this directory, the data, right? These two directories. And these two directories need to be readable and writable by the Kill the Newsletter environment. So when I'm running the app, I need to be able to read and write from those directories. So if you can get a hold of my application by abusing some bug, then I lost. So there is no actual benefit from having a different user, or at least I don't think there is. Correct me if I'm wrong, if you think I'm wrong. Then I tell where it should deploy to, this host, and then I tell it where to get the code from. So it gets from GitHub and from this branch. Then I tell it where to, in the file system of the DigitalOcean machine, where I want to deploy the app, which is in this folder. And then I run, there are 3 scripts that I run, okay? So these 3 scripts, this first one, it runs just once when I am setting up the machine. And that's when I go to DigitalOcean, I create a droplet, or that's how they call a machine, a droplet. I create a droplet and I run this script once. Then this will run after so there are 2 scripts that run when I'm doing this setup. This is running before I clone the repository from here, and this is doing something after I clone the repository. So this sets up the permissions you need to be able to clone the repository, and some installation or some configuration after I already have the code. Let's look at what these 2 are doing in a moment. Just so you know, the 3rd script will run on every deploy. That's the thing that runs every time I push to GitHub. These 2 only run once. When I just created the machine, I go on my own development machine, I say npm run deploy setup, which runs this, and this sets up the machine which is running these 2 scripts. So PM2 is going to run this, then it's going to clone, then it's going to run that. Okay, pre-setup. What is this doing? Well, it's installing Node by doing this. These 2 lines install Node on a fresh Ubuntu instance. And this line is saying, please meet github.com, add it to the list of trusted SSH targets. Okay, so now I am establishing trust between the new machine that I just set up and GitHub. And so this is going to run on setup just once before PM2 clones the repository. So then it installs Node, and then it establishes this connection, and this is the truly important part. It definitely needs to be able to clone from the repository. So that's why I have this line here. Okay, so it cloned from the repository. Now it will run this, which installs the dependencies. So npm CI is similar to the thing we looked at before with install CI test. It will not run the tests, but it will install packages only looking at the package lock.json, which is created every time I run npm install on my machine, but npm CI will not try to fix mistakes, install new dependencies. It will just look at the log file, and if there is a problem, it will complain. That's all. And I'm passing the production flag because I don't want to install development dependencies like things for testing. For instance, jest. Completely unnecessary. So I am skipping those. And then it will run pm2. So npx allows me to run commands that I installed with npm. So for instance, pm2. And it's saying startup. So what this is doing is it's telling pm2 to install it installs pm2 in the process manager for Ubuntu, which is systemd. So anytime Ubuntu starts, it will start systemd, which will start pm2. And that's all. It's just going to start pm2. And now pm2 will be able to manage the Node.js processes and caddy. So it's just starting pm2, but it's not telling pm2 to do anything. It's just saying, oh, anytime you start the machine, also start pm2 for me, and that's all. Okay, now let's look at the line that runs every time I push to GitHub. Because every time I push to GitHub to master, it will run this line, which will run this line eventually, okay? So the first thing is pm2 is going to go to this URL and to the repository on GitHub, and it will fetch the latest changes. It's going to do that first. Then it will run the post deploy line, which again installs the dependencies again, and that is because the dependencies may have changed. In fact, I may be pushing to GitHub exactly because I updated a dependency. And then it will run this line that is starting or restarting, depending on if the project is running or not. But it will start or restart the apps that we looked at before, both the Kill the Newsletter app and Caddy as well. And it will run npx pm2 save. So pm2 here is saying, okay, take all of these processes that are running, so both Kill the Newsletter and Caddy, and remember them, save them. So now the next time that we shut down the server and start it again, it will start pm2 because of the thing we set up here. And pm2 will know that it needs to run because it's saved, right? So it will know that it needs to run these apps. So what I'm doing here is anytime I push, I deploy, and I restart the project with the new code base. And if something happens and I have to restart the machine, it will restart the services without me even having to interfere. It will just restart the services. I won't have to look at it. So that's what this part is doing. And then there are these SSH options that I need to set up. This is the same as that. And that is because the connection between GitHub Actions and DigitalOcean, my machine, that connection is new every time, because every time I push, I get a new machine to run the GitHub Actions. So I'm saying here, okay, GitHub Action, introduce yourself to DigitalOcean. That's what this line is doing. And it's the same as here, in which DigitalOcean was being introduced to GitHub, not exactly to GitHub Actions, but to this URL on GitHub. So this is the configuration between GitHub Actions and DigitalOcean, and this is for the part between DigitalOcean and back into GitHub, but this time for the repository, not for a GitHub action. And also, I want to make this connection, so it's going to go like this. It goes from GitHub Actions to DigitalOcean, from DigitalOcean to the repository on GitHub, right? So this first connection, it's okay. I am going to go into how I set this up, but this connection is taken care of. But how do I do the second connection? Well, I can just reuse the key, the SSH key from the first connection. So this is a clever mechanism that I created for deploying to GitHub. So I connect from the GitHub action to the DigitalOcean, and I reuse that credential to go back into GitHub for the repository. And that's what this forward agent thing is doing here. The agent is just storing all the keys and credentials, and I'm forwarding it. So when I connect from GitHub action to DigitalOcean, I am saying, okay, this connection in DigitalOcean is capable of accessing anything that GitHub action, can access. And of course, that includes the repository itself. So the way this works is there are three parts: GitHub Actions, DigitalOcean, GitHub for the repository. And the connection is established using the agent, the key in the agent. So effectively what I have to do to set this up initially is I need an SSH key whose private part, the secure part, is on GitHub, set up as a secret in the repository and used here. And that's the part that I have to explain last. So there is a private key as a secret on GitHub. That's the private key. The public key, the matching public key, is in DigitalOcean. So I can access the DigitalOcean machine from the GitHub action. But I also set that public part as part of the repository so that it can access the contents of the repository. So both the private and the public key are on GitHub so that I can do this round trip. And that is deployment. So here I'm just calling PM2 to read this configuration at the bottom and run the project. And that is all there is to it. We looked at every single line of Kill the Newsletter. This was a complete review of Kill the Newsletter. Thanks for sticking around. Thanks for using and being interested in Kill the Newsletter. I hope this was fun for you and informative. There are quite a bundle of unique ideas in this app, from using template strings in JavaScript to use as HTML and have that with syntax highlighting and formatting and looking good. And then there is the deployment idea, which is kind of unique. The idea of actually running the web server and the client, running the web server and the email server, and then in the tests, just not pretending to make requests, but actually making requests to the actual servers. These are all ideas that took a lot of time to get to them, and they are kind of simple and obvious when you look at them, but they are unique, and I have not seen them in many apps, and some of them I have not seen them in any app at all. The idea of using JS DOM to manipulate XML, the idea of sanitizing the inputs in a way that actually works for all emails I could find in the project. So yeah, plenty of different wacky ideas put together in such a simple service. And I hope you got something out of this and continue developing your awesome web applications. Thanks for watching. I see you on the next one.